Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Tonic Accord podcast. I am Drew Nepoli, accompanied by my colleague and friend, Alex Kapitko. To this week, we're going to touch on two different topics. They're not entirely related, but they're both interesting, and we want to talk about it a little bit. First of all, we want to cover the recent events in Santiago, Chile, and we've had protests in the millions there, and we'll discuss that more in detail in a second. And then the second topic we'll be discussing later is just based on how much it's been in the news lately. What is due process? What does those words mean, and what does that look like in the context of the United States and our Constitution? So we're going to touch on that a little bit, and I think that'll be informative and interesting. But before we get into it, Alex, how are you doing over there?
Hey, Drew. I'm doing pretty well. Nighttime in Spain. The clocks went back an hour, so it got dark today at about 6. So I don't like that. This time of year is always kind of depressing for me, but life is good. How about you?
Yeah, I hate when it gets dark so early. I honestly we can even start with this. Like, it would start with an agrarian society. The reason we switched the clocks back and forth, I think it had something to do with the harvest and using sunlight to farm. But I feel like now that most people don't farm, I'd be totally down to not have to move our clocks around and to keep sunlight later into the winter.
Right. It doesn't make any sense to me. And plus, so in Spain and Europe, we had the time change this week and I think next week. So now our time differences are just all messed up right now. Usually we're 9 hours different. Now it's 8 hours.
Yeah.
It's just too much. It's just pointless.
Hey, luckily we all have like phones that do it automatically. Man, back when you had to manually change all your clocks, and if you didn't, it would screw up your whole day.
Yeah.
Rough.
Yeah. No, it's annoying for sure. Well, yeah, definitely. So
back to more important issues in the world. Santiago, Chile, and Chile in general. We've in the last about a week or so, we've had massive protests in the millions in the city of Santiago, and even more around the entire country. And I think a lot of people, especially with the protests in Hong Kong, a lot of people are unfamiliar with Chile's massive protests. They're newer, and I think it's just an area of the world that gets covered less or paid attention to less in America. So yeah, we want to dive into that. But do you want to give us some context, Alex, of what exactly is happening down there? Why did these protests start, and what's been a result so far?
Yeah, definitely. I think you touched it really well, that with Hong Kong going on and just everything else going on right now, this has kind of been an afterthought. But it's actually been going on for a couple weeks now. And for example, this comes from the BBC. Last Friday night, in response to widespread protests, tanks rolled down the streets of Chile in Santiago, the capital. And this was an eerie sight because Chile is a country that is widely described to be the strongest democracy and the most developed economy in Latin America. And so this conflict started in Santiago last week, which were just peaceful protests in order of a metro strike, mainly because metro stations increased their fares. And for a person making minimum wage, a week's worth of transportation to and from work would equate to about 21% of their salary. And so this started off with just a metro wage, but then it turned into major protests throughout the city. And a lot of people say these protests are mainly about inequality, inefficient and unjust healthcare systems, increased electricity prices, privatized water, assassinations of environmental workers, workers' rights, and indigenous rights. And so now, unfortunately, since then, these protests, which have included marches, were met with increasingly violent responses from the state and the military, which has included tear gas, pellet guns, and rubber bullets, violent arrests and beatings. And this is kind of an eerie parallel to what happened in 1973 with Pinochet, which led to a 17-year dictatorship under which tens of thousands were killed, disappeared, and tortures. And so it was an interesting quote that was from a Chilean author named Daniel Villalobos, I think. He said, "How come when you want to protect the citizens, you send to the streets the same institution that never told us where they threw the bodies?"
Right.
And so, yeah, Drew, I mean, it's escalating quite quickly in a negative way, and no one's really talking too much about it.
Yeah. Well, we did have this news yesterday, and we'll see if this actually does lead to any change. But the Chilean president, whose name is Sebastian Pinera, excuse me, and he just called for his entire cabinet to resign after the large-scale protests. So, because 20, like you mentioned, there has been violence, right? 20 people have been reported to have been killed in the protests, and that's 20 too many. But we're now seeing some kind of radical shift, I guess. The Chilean president calling his entire cabinet to resign is pretty huge. We'll see if that's just kind of like we'll see. I mean, obviously, having one person leave, you don't know who they're going to be replaced with. He could replace him with even more authoritarian figures. So we don't know where this is going yet. But like you mentioned, there has been violence, and we certainly don't want it to escalate to more violence. But it's interesting that based on what I've read in the Wall Street Journal as well as BBC, that there does not seem to be like a leader with an exact set of demands. So, now you covered a lot of the topics that are kind of the general topics, but it doesn't seem like there's like an exact like list of demands. And it might be that various factions, one's more focused on indigenous justice, one's more focused on economic justice. It doesn't seem like there's an exact through line between everybody, but it's just more of a massive general discomfort and what's the word? They're not disapproval of the current government.
Right.
And to have 1 million people in the streets in one day in one city is pretty amazing and impressive. And it's obvious that this is not a minority. This is a majority movement in the country.
Right. And I think you're accurate there. I think this is showing that people are just in general angry at the current situation in Chile more than any specific policies. I think it's showing just a lack of happiness with first off Piñera's presidency, his government, and the inequality. BBC also does have a report that says that actually Chile is one of the poorest and least equal countries in the top 30 wealthiest nations. And apparently wealth has gotten better, but still it really does seem that inequality in Chile is extremely bad. In 2006, the richest 20% earned 10 times more than the poorest 20%, according to a government survey. And so I think a lot of people think of Chile as this wealthy democracy amongst kind of a chaotic South America, but it's unfortunately been a very neoliberal country with a lot of policies designed to help industry. And I think we're seeing that a lot of working people are fed up with it, and yeah, like even a 10% fare raise on their metro fees, is extremely hard if you're barely making enough to make ends meet. And I think that's why this Piñera president is very unpopular, is because he's I'm pretty sure he's a billionaire. I'm gonna have to check that, but he's either way extremely wealthy, and I think he hasn't done enough inside of the country to fight corruption and inequality. And then when he's basically saying that the authorities are at war with the protesters, but then he's also now backtracking, I don't think he's a very reliable figure.
Yeah, I just looked it up to confirm. You are correct. His net worth is $2.8 billion.
Whew. So it's bad when there's a billionaire, telling people to calm down, that aren't making enough to make ends meet. You know what I mean?
Right. And his fortune was made off of a credit card company called Bankcard.
That's fitting.
Yeah. So it seems like I have a feeling that in the coming years we're going to see a lot of protests like this over that start with something small and that kind of snowball into overall disapproval of the inequality. Because we do. I mean, we have a world that produces so much, and there is so much wealth being made. But, in my opinion, it seems like most of the wealth is going to the hands of the few and not the many, in most cases. So I have a feeling that Santiago is not going to be the only one. Hong Kong is more about like political freedoms and stuff because Hong Kong's very wealthy in general. But it might also spark and influence other countries to more kind of protest against inequality in general. Nicaragua has had protests in the last few years over the same thing against the Ortega administration. Just again, more political and economic freedoms being the crux of the protests. I think we're going to see it a lot more over the world.
I think that's a good point.
You could even say in the United States we've seen it in the voting booth, right? I think Trump was a lot of people's their vote was for economic anxieties and trying to maintain American jobs. I think that was a good majority of people voted for Trump for that reason. Whether or not that's happened, you know, that's for us to discuss at a different time, or we've discussed later. But I think a lot of people are feeling the economic anxiety, right? Like globalism and how many billionaires. I've always, like, when I talk to Democrats and Republicans, everyone distrusts billionaires. It's just which billionaires you distrust. But like, I've definitely sensed from both sides of the aisle a distrust and a disapproval of some of the top 1% wealthy billionaires that influence politics and create laws for the people below them. I don't think it's really a party thing. I think we're going to see this all over the world.
Completely true. Very, very good point. And you're right. Is that I think, especially with the transparency of news and social media, I think people are starting to be able to see this mass wealth more than before. And they're seeing these leaders that are supposed to be, held accountable by the people, but seem to be discontent, rich, powerful, don't pay their share. And it's irritating, It's actually interesting. One of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this today was last night I was getting drinks with a buddy of mine. He's Irish, but he spent time in Chile, I think. And he had a good point about the economic policy in Chile. Historically, it's always been a testing ground for U.S. neoliberal policies. It's since the Chicago Five, which were economists that helped Pinochet use American-esque neoliberal policies in the 70s.
Right.
Chile has kind of been a place where we've tested out policies that eventually we use in the United States. And so to me, it almost seems like this growing issue in Chile and other parts of the world is kind of maybe a referendum on neoliberalism to a certain extent. Because also no one's really talking about, but there's also protests in Lebanon that are getting quite bad right now as well, that are very similar in nature to Chile because they're on inequality. And it makes me wonder is if there needs to be a new paradigm in the world other than neoliberalism, because it seems that neoliberalism has created a lot of inequality.
Right. It's like a flash in the pan, right? Like, it's very good at quickly expanding an economy, right? Compared to the more like ISI, import substitute economies, and the more like your countries like Nicaragua, like Bolivia and Venezuela. These are countries that have had slow growth in their economies. Venezuela had one upshoot because of oil, but then now we're seeing that that's completely eradicated as well. But so neoliberal policies can rapidly expand an economy and get ahead of your competitor, but the long-term cost seems to be inequality, right? It's very good at creating a lot of GDP, but does that GDP get spread around to everyone in the nation? We're finding that it's not so much. So, it's definitely, I think it definitely is a referendum on the paradigm we have, is that we have, billionaires. And whether or not that's truly just when other people are struggling to pay metro fare. And it also goes to show of how something small can grow into something so large. I mean, we can go back to almost any protest in history like that. I mean, even our own country, the Boston Tea Party, right? You put a tax on tea, but that snowballs into, well, are they taxing us? We should have some representation in this. And then you had other taxes and stamp taxes, and then suddenly now you have a full-blown revolution. And it all starts somewhere, right? What's the straw that broke the camel's back? It looks like in Chile, it was this metro fare was on top of everything else. Now we have another straw that broke the camel's back, and we're seeing what happens.
Yeah, completely. And I think you're right, is that neoliberalism did help us, and especially the West, grow financially in a short period of time. And we've seen that in every case possible. And I think that's why Democrats and Republicans, right and left, all one way or another support neoliberalism to a certain extent. I mean, the Bushes, the Clintons,
right,
the Reagans,
Obama, even with his trade deals.
Oh, completely. And I think even things such as NAFTA, as good as they could be for the United States, they are neoliberal policies that kind of have hurt some of our allies along the way. And I think you were right about Trump, is that good or bad, he's kind of a referendum on neoliberalism. He's someone that's flourished inside of the neoliberal system, but I wouldn't really call his views neoliberal. And I think that's why some people are like, hell yeah, let's go with this, because he's someone someone hey, I took advantage of this system and did pretty well for myself, and so I know how flawed the system is, and let's destroy the system together. Whether he's doing that or not,
Right.
it's an interesting way to look at it.
Well, yeah, we all know that looking back, 2020 hindsight, he was very good at the rhetoric of making himself feel like an outsider, right? Like you said, like he was someone that's flourished in the system. I mean, he is a billionaire because of the neoliberal system, but he was very good at being like, no, 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 I'm not part of it. Let's drain the swamp. They over there are the ones that are robbing you blind from your pockets while you're not looking, and it's also politicians involved. And he's not wrong. That's the thing too. Is like he was very right about there's a swamp in politics. There's globalist forces are going to be going to take your jobs and automate you out and outsource you out. Those are all things that are very real anxieties that people have and are very real and happening. But he was able to just have people forget that he was also perpetuating that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, completely. And he's not the only one now. I mean,
Right.
We're seeing a lot of similar people now rising. In Ukraine, hell, Zelensky, a movie star and comedian who pretty much he played a president on Ukrainian TV, and next thing we know, he's president. And
Right.
it's just fascinating that a lot of people around the world, I think, are sick of politicians and they're sick of the establishment. I think every part of it, from even Hong Kong, though it's more about political rights, I would say it also has to do with our past policy. I'm just curious to see where we go. I mean, last year you had those yellow vest strikes in France, over the raising of carbon taxes.
Mm-hmm.
Working people are angry, and I'm curious what happens in Santiago, because right now it's just Chile has such a dark 20th century. It's so easy for places like this to go to resort back to flip back to where they were.
Yeah, it is scary what's going on in Santiago. I do have a little bit of hope, especially now that the president called for his cabinet to resign. I also think, we live in a different world where obviously it still happens. I mean, we still see it happen, but I feel like there is more fear from the government of committing atrocities and because people see it more. People have phones out now. It's hard to. I for example, I don't think China could do another Tiananmen Square, right? Mm-hmm. That was a brutal atrocities, and within China they've successfully erased that from their history. But the rest of the world still knows about it. We don't know the exact details, but I don't think that could happen today because people in China, even though they have a pretty strict government on their speech, they still have phones with videos, and all it takes is one tweet, and now the whole world sees it. So, whether or not that, obviously there's still atrocities going on, but I have a feeling that at least in Chile, especially someone now that it is more, westernized, especially compared to its neighbors, I have a feeling the pressure's on to be like, are we going to regress back into our dictatorial 70s? Or are we going to actually make some changes and see if we can weather the storm and maybe, give up a few things, have the protests stop and go back to normal? I also have to imagine, let's remember that this is a protest against the elite billionaire class. The elite billionaire class is going to lose money too if these protests last a long time, just like in Hong Kong where the companies are asking protesters to stop because they're losing money. And the protesters are like, screw you. That's part of the point.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And you're right. We're in such a transparent world most of the time that, yeah, you're right. It would be really hard to duplicate a Tiananmen Square or anything like that. I think you said 19 people have already been shot, and already there's just major outrage about it.
Right.
So yeah, I think you're right. It'll be interesting to see how this goes because you're right. Piñera going away, or not going away, but getting rid of his whole staff is an interesting move. To me, it doesn't sound like he still is very liked no matter what, and I think it's going to look like he probably will step down, I would imagine, or something along those forms, because it kind of sounds like it's too late for him to really rebuild much of this, but who knows? I'm not an expert on Chile by any means.
It could be that his calling his entire cabinet to resign is less about the protesters are right, and more it's a Machiavellian way to keep his power. Because if he's like, well, look, if I can just clear house but I remain in power. Maybe the people will be satiated enough to be like, yeah, look, he changed his whole cabinet, and then he can just go back to business as normal, or business as almost as normal as it was. Like,
Yeah, that's a good point.
to me, it looks like a kind of guy that doesn't want to lose power. So he says, "Screw you" to all his friends, and like, you go down with the ship. I'm dipping. Maybe I can get out of this. But I think you're right though that if he doesn't, if he, it's one, it depends on who he replaces them with, and two, if he really does go through with some of the demands for like higher taxes on the wealthy, lower taxes on transportation and electricity. If he does all that, maybe he can get out of this, but it might be the kind of thing where you said where he has to step down because the protesters just keep going.
Yeah. Yeah, it'll be interesting, and I mean, it is scary that whenever a leader tries to consolidate power, it's never a good sign.
No, it's
Especially
not.
with a country with this history. But they are a flourishing democracy right now, and inequality actually has gotten better since 2006. So there are positives, but I think it's just the straw that broke the camel's back. Like you said.
Right, right.
So yeah, I don't know. We'll have to keep up to this. I don't know. Do you have any other thoughts about Chile?
I was just interested to see if this, like, along with Nicaraguan stuff, if this starts to spread to other parts of South America, especially.
Mm-hmm.
If we
Probably.
start to see this in Colombia, Bolivia, or I mean, obviously we see it in Venezuela for a little bit different reasons, but similar.
Yeah.
Corruption and power and stuff, but they almost probably want a more neoliberal society in Venezuela.
I would imagine yeah, you're right. Venezuela probably wants to kind of just reset back to center.
Yeah,
They want to just listen to some Tonic Accord down there for a little bit. Or something.
There you go.
But I mean, Argentina is pretty bad right now. They're having just a huge economic crisis. Their currency's free falling. So there's a lot of issues in South America right now. So yeah, we're gonna have to see, because I think you're right. I think this trend probably will follow, because that's been a big issue in all of South and Central America, is inequality.
Absolutely.
Because you kind of have this European class, and then you have this more indigenous, poorer class that has always been kind of subjugated and not treated fairly throughout the history, since the conquests. And yeah, there's a lot of growing issues in South America, and I don't know if actually neoliberalism and capitalism in general really go with South American culture in general. I think that's why you see guys like Che Guevara and Hugo Chavez and all these leftist regimes coming to power down there, is because I think that socialism has always been kind of a part of South American culture.
Right, and well, they always got the shortest straw when it came to capitalism, right? It's a lot easier for a European country to be like, no, capitalism has been great, because they're the ones that benefited the most. It was always a resource extraction out of South America and out of Africa, for another example, that was part of the global capitalist system, right? So yeah, it definitely does seem like they probably have a bad taste of neoliberal in their mouth, because neoliberalism has not been very kind, like you've been saying.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
so we'll have to see where this goes. Again, it's just an ongoing thing. We're in an ever-changing world, but yeah, it's exciting to see, though. In a way, it is exciting to see so many millions of people, coming out and waving Chilean flags, because they want to believe in a better Chile.
I think you're right. In the long run, it's nice to see people feeling that they have the freedom and the voice to do it, and hopefully it'll pay out for them.
Absolutely. And hopefully that they get the due process in their country that they deserve. That was
there's the link.
Yeah, there's my half-assed segue. So yeah, we wanted to touch a little bit on due process, especially since I don't want to take too much of the route of just this whole impeachment thing. I want to go more into like the Constitution and what due process means in general. But we just been hearing it a lot because of Trump claims that his impeachment inquiry is not due process,
right?
And there's a lot of it thrown around, like, what is due process? What does that mean? And so we're gonna dive in to a little bit of what that means. So the due process clause is it's in the 5th and the 14th Amendments in the U.S. Constitution. Due process deals with the administration of justice. and a safeguard against the arbitrary denial of life, liberty, and property from the government. In short term, it basically means that if the government's going to seize something of your property or put you in jail, it has a certain process that it needs to go through to make sure that you've been given basically a fair chance to defend yourself, and be constitutionally allowed to take away some of your freedoms.
Right. And of course, we're seeing this a lot right now, unfortunately, because it does do a full circle back to Trump, in which he is now claiming, and Republicans are claiming, that he is not being granted a fair due process in this impeachment inquiry that people such as Nixon and Clinton were granted. And so it's become kind of the new argument and talking point that Trump has not been given proper due process.
Right.
Interesting.
So we got to break down due process a little bit more. There's two types of due process that are used in constitutional law discussions, and the discussions of justice in general. One is procedural due process and substantive due process. So procedural is more the boring, by the book stuff. So, procedural due process is if you get arrested, you have to be given your Miranda rights. You can't have any unjust and cruel punishments. You have to be given a chance to defend yourself, and your decision must be made by a neutral decision maker.
Right.
So if that process doesn't happen, then you can't legally be taken. Your freedoms can't legally be taken away. And people have sued, and we've had court cases about this many a time of people that rig juries or whatever. That doesn't count as due process. The whole Miranda rights thing, right? People weren't originally read any rights, so they didn't know what rights they had when they were being arrested. So now part of the due process is you have to be given your rights by the arresting officer at the time you are arrested. But that's kind of what is the by the book, step by step process. The procedures, it's procedural. The other one is substantive, and that is kind of the more vague and the highly more argued over in law part of due process, where it's the kind of the due process that's maybe not necessarily written down step by step in the Constitution or in the laws, but it's stuff that we assume that the Constitution covers by expansion, and we interpret it to be so. So one big good example of this is, parents should have the due process and the ability to choose the education of their child. And again, this is argued in the details by state, right? What can you homeschool or whatever? But it was argued that the Constitution can expand to allow people to choose what they teach their kid, and it can't always be government mandated. And the government can't get rid of any freedoms from the parent for teaching the child a certain form of education. So that's the one that was more of the hazy expansion of the Constitution, and that's the one that's more argued over in great length, over what is due process.
Right, and kind of going off of the substantive due process as well, is that I'm reading that it's commonly used in two ways, and I find this sort of fascinating. One is to identify a particular line of case law and to signify a particular political attitude towards judicial review. And so a lot of these forms of litigation cases involve legal challenges about unenumerated rights that seek particular outcomes instead of merely contesting procedures and their effects. So yes, it's nice and hazy, hard to see through the muck, and it makes it interesting because I think you're right. The procedural due process is pretty black and white, right?
Mm-hmm. It's you either went through the process or you didn't.
Right. And so yeah, it's interesting, and I feel like this comes up a lot in the United States, especially during times of an impeachment, right?
Yeah, I think right now is the Republican and Trump's not all Republicans, let's be clear, but the more Trump wing of the Republican Party is arguing that Trump is not getting the substantive due process, right? One of the big things that just happened recently was Matt Gaetz, a representative from Florida, I believe. He and a bunch of his buddies in the Congress decided to storm the rooms of the Democratic impeachment hearings. They were behind closed doors. They were saying that this is, an offense to our democracy and is not part of the due process. They would probably argue that Trump deserves the substantive due process of knowing his accuser, stuff like that, and having it be in public so that he can defend himself publicly. That would be my guess as to what the argument is. Would that sound kind of in line with what you've heard as well, Alex?
Yes, and I I really go back and forth on this, man, because I think everyone wants transparency and everyone wants an open discussion, and I think taxpayers want to see this hearing, especially when it's something as important as this quid pro quo, and the Ukraine scandal. And Ambassador Bill Taylor, who is the one testifying, his opening statement, which was released, is pretty damning. And so on the right side of it, I think that they are just angry because there's been these leaks, and congressmen are talking to the media about what Taylor said. But then at the same time, there's no way for there to be an open discussion about this because no one actually knows what was completely said in the room. And so I think a lot of people feel that if these attacks and these things that Taylor said are so bad, then it needs to be said by him in front of cameras, because I think that some of these things are very damning, and without their actual proof, and there's just hearsay right now, I think a lot of Republicans could find that is not a good attack. But when it comes to these men marching in, first off, let's be clear, there were Republicans in the room.
Right.
So it's a total lie that they were saying, oh, well, it's not fair that no Republicans got to hear this hearing. That's false. Some of the people that were actually marching could have been in the room but decided not to. And to me, it always works to do theatrics, when you've ran out of reasonable defenses. And I think this was just a ploy to get the base angry, But then at the same time, I do think that there was more transparency in both the Nixon impeachment and the Clinton impeachment. A lot of people say that the Nixon inquiry was a model of bipartisan cooperation. And a lot of people say it was similar, even with Newt Gingrich, the House Speaker, when Clinton was being impeached. There was a lot of bipartisan cooperation, even though the Bart Starr investigation was a little bit questionable at times. But I think that this closed door hearing kind of just looks partisan, even if it's not.
Right. And so, yeah, I agree. Even though the Republicans in the room, I think it gives an opportunity for opponents to do exactly what they did, right? Is control the narrative, have the theatrics, and basically tell people it's a Democratic shutout, even when it's not. I also think that we have to remember, because, right, the argument from the Republican side is Trump isn't getting the substantive due process. But let's look at the other side, the procedural. You're right that the Nixon and Clinton impeachments were more transparent because procedurally they were. These new the laws that were written for these investigative bodies to do these behind closed doors testimonies and questioning, was a lot of those laws were written by Republicans during the Benghazi trials. So the procedures have actually changed, and that it is by definition, right, in the writing, going to be less transparent. And so,
right.
But I think so. Then now it's just the same procedures are being used in this impeachment inquiry. Now I agree with you. I think it might need to be more transparent now, not for the whistleblower. The whistleblower's procedural due process is that he does remain anonymous. That's the whole point of the whistleblowing in general, is you don't want a person to fear for their identity and their life because of talking about corruption. So that one still needs to be behind closed doors. But these people that are more, like Taylor, like the ambassador to Ukraine, these people, I think it should be more transparent. Maybe have some stuff that are really classified be behind closed doors, but the majority be in public. But it's just interesting that, like, the reason they're doing this though is that it is the procedure. There is procedural due process being enacted here. It's just that the rules of the process have changed since Nixon and Clinton, and they've been changed by Democrats and Republicans to be this way. So it's it's a lot of theatrics going on, but it does bring up the question of perhaps maybe the procedures should be changed back, regardless of who changed them in the first place.
Yeah.
Yeah, it brings up some certain questions, but it's definitely not a democratic shutout, and it's not like they're avoiding the procedures of due process. They're just actually following it.
Yeah, and I mean on that, the Washington Post has an interesting point. In quotes, it says, "In the federal criminal system, grand jury proceedings are secret, closed, not only to the public but also to those under investigation. Prosecutors question witnesses before the grand jury, but defense counsel are not allowed to be in the room, much less to participate. With Republican committee members present and able to ask questions at the closed house hearings, the president already has far more representation at this stage than a target of a grand jury investigation."
That's an interesting point. I mean, especially guys like Matt Gaetz, who says he loves President Trump, like literally says loves. Um, he would totally be basically just a representation for the Trump administration, and that does bring up a good point. Um,
Yeah, and it's true. I mean, I honestly kind of am angry by this. Oh, he's not getting fair due process argument, because he is. No one's jumping to just throwing him out or indicting him or whatever. I mean, they're just opening up an inquiry and talking to witnesses.
right. Exactly. I mean, it would not be due process if it was a Democratic shutout, and especially if you had Trump in handcuffs before the thing was even done. I don't even know how that would happen, but no, there is a due process being had. And again, we always bring it back to this, but the reality of our political system is he's not going to get impeached by the Senate. We know Mitch McConnell has said that already. Now, I mean, you could argue that maybe Mitch McConnell's not going in for the due process because he's already made up his mind and he wouldn't be a neutral decider.
Mm-hmm.
But again, it's up to the entire Senate as a body. But the reality is, the entire Senate as a body is not gonna indict the president, not gonna impeach the president. So even if it's the narrative, right? It's going back to the narrative, and it's really who looks better coming into this next election. And the Democrats have decided that going through with impeachment is constitutionally viable and probably a good look to do before the election.
Yes. Yes, I agree. And I do have to just state that I do think Trump is being treated differently than previous presidents when it's coming to this impeachment. And I think there's two reasons for it. I think one is that obviously we're in a hyper divisive political atmosphere, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the second reason is that I think Trump is making it easy for his opponents to believe he's guilty because he openly discusses these controversial things
Right.
and admits to foul play, right? So he's almost, I wouldn't say admitting to crimes, but he's making it so easy to jump into this. And I think that he kind of is digging his own grave when it comes to this. And I think Republicans are openly struggling with how to deal with the president with no moral compass. And evenly, Democrats are struggling with how to do this while remaining legal.
Right. How to pick their battles. I think Democrats have to pick their battles because there's so much that they could possibly get angry at with Trump. But it's like the boy who cried wolf, and we're seeing that narrative be used against the Democrats as if, oh, another inquiry, they're going to just get rid of Trump for anything. And I think they would, right? But they have to pick their
Yes.
battles, and I think they found that this Ukraine thing is a good battle to pick from their opinion, because it is pretty damning. And then again, I also don't think Rudy Giuliani is doing Trump any favors either. I think Republicans are kept shaking their heads every time Rudy Giuliani goes on Fox and Friends.
Yeah, he's been awful for Trump. I think Trump needs to fire him. I mean, Trump sometimes knows Giuliani, other times doesn't. Sometimes he's Trump's lawyer, other times Trump used to have him as an attorney.
Yeah.
But either way, I think you're right. He needs to go. I mean, he butt dialed MSNBC, I think it was last week, talking about some contract with Bahrain, and it's like, come on, man, like,
Yeah,
this
come
is.
on.
But you're right, and I mean, I think this all comes down to Giuliani more than Trump. And I think there's two things that could happen. Is Giuliani going around making foreign policy for Trump and threatening countries, or is he doing this for his private company, which is what he was doing before he worked for Trump? And I think two things can be right at the same time here. But if it's a conflict of interest, and if he's being a quasi diplomat running around the world doing things for Trump, it's kind of scary. And I think all roads lead to Giuliani here.
Yeah, it does seem like, again, not to restate everything too much, but since Trump's not really going to get impeached at all, it might be that Rudy Giuliani is now the fall guy, right? Like, I mean, Giuliani associates have already been arrested, 4 of them, I believe now. So it's like, I think I think you're right. It might have to come down to Trump was just like, oh, I just want dirt on my opponent, and Giuliani, you handle it, and then Giuliani was the mastermind, quote unquote, because believe me, it doesn't seem like he's mastered this at all. But
No.
he was supposed to be the mastermind behind this whole Ukraine and other foreign leaders thing, and it seems like he's just going to be taking the fall on this one.
Yeah, it really does seem that way, and I mean, back to the whistleblowers and now the Ukraine ambassador Taylor testifying and this Republican walk-in. To me, it's just kind of alarming what they're saying about Trump. And now Trump's, calling Taylor, a liar and not credible. But this is a career hero that was a military veteran. He spent his time in Washington
Multiple administrations.
Exactly, and I think it's substantial what these people are saying.
I think it also comes down, you know how everyone talks about like people vote for like who they rather have a beer with or whatever. It also comes down to like at the end of the day, who do you think is more trustworthy? Like the guy that's been an ambassador to multiple administrations, career service, and has people vouch that he's like trustworthy, or Donald Trump, who's been known time and time and again to, I mean, I would say straight out lie. I think if other people that are maybe even like more Trump fans, you still have to admit that he bends the truth, if anything.
Oh yeah.
I mean, or exaggerates. Everything to him is either the best or the worst. Like I just don't trust people that exaggerate everything.
No.
If everything's the best or everything's the worst, it's like that's just not true. I just don't believe that.
Yeah, his perfect phone conversation with Zelensky, his perfect best memos in history. It's like who has ever said their phone call was perfect? I've never heard someone get off the phone and say, "Hey, Mom, I just had a perfect conversation over the phone." It's like
that was perfect and innocent, and I'm a stable genius. Like what? Yeah. And at the end of the day, it's like I'm going to trust a guy like Taylor more.
I totally agree. And there's no reason not to trust him.
Right.
So but going back to the due process thing, I still think he's been given the benefit of the doubt by at least most legal professionals and most ranking congressmen. Obviously, you're right. Democrats would love to get rid of Trump if they could. But on the day-to-day basis, they are doing a fair impeachment inquiry. And the Senate is also not going to pass it anyways. So I think everyone's freaking out a little bit too much about this. And I think it is just theatrics with the Republicans right now because basically they're running out of arguments. They're running out of defenses,
Yeah.
And I mean, between Syria and this and just all the chaos is that it's really getting hard to defend Trump. And so I guess stage a walk-in. And I mean, I love it. They all brought their phones in when it's supposed to be a place you're not allowed to bring phones. I mean, just their lack of just common sense with this is insane to me.
It does seem pretty desperate. It's not a good look, at least from my point of view. When I heard about it, I cringed, and especially when I learned it was led by Matt Gaetz. That guy, I don't know. That guy is so cringy to me. He's like the Republican Beto O'Rourke to me. Grandstanding and like I love President Trump and like I don't know. He's equally as cringy to me as Beto O'Rourke is with his Spanish.
Oh God, yeah. I actually have to ask you. This is a little off. You obviously weren't here last week. I talked about the debates a little bit. What are you thinking now going forward with that?
Well, just a quick little touch up before we head out of here. I do think that it was fun and interesting to see Elizabeth Warren be the punching bag.
Yeah.
I mean, it was so obvious that it's so obvious that everyone considers her the front runner now, not just the polls, right?
Right.
Joe Biden was probably not happy about being in second place now, but he's probably pretty happy to get a break from the beating. People were really hammering into Warren, and I don't know why she didn't just admit, like Bernie did, that she's going to raise taxes. Because her whole thing was, if you're with your healthcare plan, are you going to raise taxes? And she's been holding out like it's about costs, not really answering the question. Whereas Bernie was like, yeah, I'm going to raise your taxes, and I'm going to decrease your medical costs. Whether or not you believe that, at least Bernie was able to just like admit that he's gonna raise taxes. And especially since Bernie already did that, it looks really bad when a Warren still skirts around the question like that. Because it's like, we all know the answer is yes. You are going to raise taxes on the middle class a little bit. And then but then just say that and then go into your bit about family costs and whatever. But it just looked bad when you had one candidate being upfront about it and another candidate, Warren, being not upfront about it when we all know the answer is yes.
I completely agree, man. And I think it's going to come back to bite her because she's tried to be this transparent and honest person, and this is not being transparent, you know? And the big issue I have with her as well going forward is that if she doesn't acknowledge this now, I think either way she's going to have some issues, because if she says it, it's going to be a soundbite for Trump's attack campaigns, right?
Right.
But if she doesn't do it, and then Bernie does, people are going to be like, "Well, she's a liar. She already lied about her, Native American heritage, blah blah blah." It's just, it's going to be tough. She's going to have a really uphill battle, I still think. I don't know.
I think at this point, it's like, look, Trump's going to do whatever he can to control his narrative. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I don't think giving him that one soundbite is going to sway people that are already on that side of the camp. You know what I mean? Like,
true.
I think I would just go out and be like, yeah, I'm gonna raise some taxes and everything else is gonna be cheaper. That's what it's. I actually don't know if I buy her plan yet personally, but if I was her strategist, I would just say that. I'd be like, yeah, we're gonna raise taxes and everything else you do regarding your life will be less expensive.
Completely.
I would just own it. Because I think it's worked for Bernie Sanders. Even though he's not in the lead, he has a rabid fan base that is very loyal, and that's why he keeps getting donation numbers in the high millions compared to others. So, yeah, it was interesting. I thought Buttigieg had a good night. I thought everyone else was kind of forgettable, and yeah, I think Warren was the punching bag because she's the leader now.
Yeah, definitely. And my girl Tulsi Gabbard's been having an interesting week too.
Yeah, there's like conspiracy theories about her and stuff now.
Yeah, a lot. She is fascinating to me because obviously she's not a Assad sympathizer, but she did go over there and meet with him, and so she has not helped her case, and now she's an isolationist, and actually her policies are probably pretty similar to Trump's on the Middle East, and it is interesting. I think it's a low blow from Clinton. I think Tulsi Gabbard actually had a good attack back when she called her a Russian asset. Tulsi's like, Hillary, people are sick of your voice in politics. It's time to move on,
Yeah, I agree. I thought that was a good clap back, but I still don't think it's enough I don't think she has the chutzpah, and especially with this attack, I don't think she's going to go far in this primary.
No, me neither.
So, and Tim Ryan dropped out too. So without Tulsi and Tim Ryan, you're seeing a lot of moderates drop out. It looks like it's going to be the progressives that are going to stay in, and Buttigieg, which is like in between moderate and progressive. It looks like it's going to be a progressive primary, and so Joe Biden's probably going to have to do a lot of self-analysis to see how progressive he wants to go to stay in.
Yeah, I think that's a good take. I've been kind of convinced on Amy Klobuchar. I think she had a decent debate, and she's kind of a nice alternative for me, but I still don't know how much strength she has. So I think you're right. I think it is going to be a progressive, which I think is going to be bad for the general election. Mm-hmm. But you're right. I think that's where it's going.
Well, with that, I think we're going to wrap this episode up. Again, as always, you can find us on YouTube, Podbean, Apple Podcasts, Facebook, Instagram, all the good stuff. We would love to hear from you. Leave a comment. Any kind of feedback is appreciated and great. We had a couple comments on the Roe versus Wade episode, and that was fantastic to see. So, again, as always, this has been the Tonic Accord, and have a great week.
Bye, guys.